Most of you in this room probably know this, but let me just briefly suggest, right, that already starting from the conversation of Hispanic-serving institutions is a space of compromise because it is a federal law response to what really was an equity project. And each legal response to an equity project also has an advocacy story, so it's fair to understand that what the advocacy story was about was a recognition that the concentration de facto, at least in modern times, of Latinx students in higher education resulted in disparities that we are all way too familiar with. Disparities in terms of resources, funding, but also disparities in terms of outcomes, at least as traditionally measured, but also disparities in terms of the institutions that were being occupied in great numbers by the Latinx communities. What you saw at the time of the adoption of the federal legislation was that most Hispanic-serving institutions were not your Research One's institutions. In fact, I'm pretty sure there were none at the time. Mm-hmm. All of them tended to be four-year private institutions or low-ranked four-year public institutions, and in many cases, community colleges. And therefore, the federal response was quite imperfect, which it was to just give funding, to try to solve problems that were much deeper, more structural. And so a lot of times, institutions of higher learning think of Hispanic-serving institutions as a way to get money, which I think is completely the wrong approach. I do want to say that one of the things that we brought to the table was to really think about the evolution of Hispanic-serving institutions, because we are now, decades later, more than 500 Hispanic service institutions across the United States, at least 35%, not surprisingly, of which are found in the state of California. In fact, there's sort of this vision that in a couple of years, all higher educations will be Hispanic serving in the state of California because of our demographics. But more importantly, perhaps, that 15 of those today are also Research One, which suggests that we are also now in high concentrations in elite spaces within higher education. And I do think that that was an opportunity to really reframe the conversation about what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and really what is our responsibility as Research One institutions to reframe the conversation. And that's what we try to do. I'll really go very quickly through this, but I really wanted to emphasize how unique this opportunity was in the state of California, given our demographics, and of course, the growth of Latinx students in the last 2 decades in the United States. It's important to know it's driven now by birth, no longer through migration. And because it's now driven by birth, it has meant that there has been an implosion of Latinx students going into higher education. That's the good news. In the last decade or so, the growth in Latinx kids going into higher education is about over 50%. Imagine that. So it means that in the state of California, where Latinx students are concentrated, this is what you see. You see more than 50% of our students graduating from high school being Latinx students, about 40% in higher education now, and of course, still within our historical context of exclusion from higher education, only 18% of the adult population with some type of college exposure. This shows you that the disparities in terms of framing this as an equity project is that we also have to recognize that this is also a class project, because poverty rates tend to be very high among Latinx communities. And that we have a lot of work to do because there are gaps. When you look at the Latinx student population in the state of California, only 37% of them are college ready to be able to go into a 4-year institution. And so here we are celebrating the idea that not only UC Davis, but 5 other UCs are becoming Hispanic-serving institutions. But when we put it in context, I need people to understand that we are still only educating 4% of Latinx students in the state of California. Overwhelmingly, our Latinx students are going into community colleges at 72%, and that seems to me deeply problematic from the perspective of equity. since we know how much hierarchy matters also in higher education. The one piece of good news is that UC Davis and the UC system is doing really well in educating first-gen and low-income students. And so this shows you the data that Latinx students in the UC system tend to be very highly represented as first-gen low-income students. Of course, we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to skip this slide. So when we sort of took up this project, we understood this context, and we wanted from the very beginning to charge it to approach it as an ambitious project. And we decided to look at it this way, that we needed to focus pre-UC Davis, we needed to focus the UC Davis experience, and then post-UC Davis to connect ourselves to community at either ends, and to really understand this as an equity project throughout. And because I'm running out of time, I'm just gonna keep going. What we ended up with in terms of our report was to have 4 values that were driving our recommendations. And these 4 values are justified through, like I said, serious crit theory and serious evidence. One piece is the equity project, which we frame very squarely as a racial and cultural equity project in the state of California, recognizing the unique civil rights struggles of Latinx communities in the state. We also talk about debunking the myth that these students are coming from a space of deficit, because what we show is that we became an HSI as we became a much more competitive place to get into. And if you're only educating 4% of our Latinx students, how dare you say that they are the deficit? These are the cream of the crop within our communities, and they bring so much incredible cultural wealth and other kinds of wealth that we're not recognizing. So we've coined the frame Rising Scholars to figure out how to really reframe the conversations around how we view these students. We also talked about the institutional transformation piece, because when we often talk about the underperformance, the gaps in graduation rates, which we do have in our system, we often think that it's the fault of the student. What is the deficit for the student? And we started to reframe the conversation to talk about the absence of a culture of belonging for these students in institutions like UC Davis. And so we spend a lot of time discussing that. And finally, we go back to the idea of situating our purpose as an HSI back to the idea of land grant, to serve the public good. And so what are we doing, right, to serve the public good and utilize this as an opportunity to move us forward? So in the end, I do think it gave us this vision of viewing our students as rising scholars and connecting them to the idea that their success was the success of our families, the success of our entire communities, and the success of our state. And we had to do that embedded in these touch points that you can see here, and I don't have time to elaborate. But one of the challenges of doing a project like this that is this ambitious is that everything in the kitchen needed to be in the soup, you know what I'm saying? Like all of the ingredients that you could possibly imagine. And the more we spoke to people, the more they wanted to include. It became a way of fixing the institution. And that is a really complicated project to undertake. I'm still recovering, I'm exhausted from that process, and like all of us who worked on this. So our journey was an educational journey, and we did all of these things, including telling the stories of the pioneros. We approached it in the way that the work of equity has always been done, is by honoring the past and also thinking about the future, hearing the stories, the testimonials from students, from faculty, from staff, who wanted their voices represented. And so the challenge when you do a project like this is that you have to balance all of these things when you are thinking about, you know, the recommendations that you're going to give. Are you going to be pragmatic? Are you going to be radical? Is it going to be somewhere in between? And we had to navigate all of those things, because I had to say to my more radical colleagues in the room, we have to acknowledge the institution where we are. And sometimes there's a saying in Spanish, and this actually is in the report, I'm very proud of this because I said it. There's a saying in Spanish, no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo. Yes, it's true, you cannot block the sun with one finger. And when you try to do that, right, you make lots of mistakes if you try to be too pragmatic in solving a big problem. But at the same time, right, the problem is when you create a vision that is not implementable, it also leads to despair. And so we were trying to really straddle this space of trying to get it right. I'm not sure that we were successful but I can tell you it was ambitious. And so we have 4 broad goals, 52 recommendations, 11 priorities in year 1, 27 new metrics that should define what measuring success should look like at Research 1 institutions, and 3 accountability mechanisms. And when I hope the report is public, and I hope they don't touch it too much, I hope that you take pride in owning this document, because the only way that it will be implemented is through a collective vision. So I'll stop there because I know I'm out of time. Thank you.